solely, so heavy, ripe and ready beneath the canopy.
Well, you're very welcome to the Ecovillage's new lunchtime webinar series, Úlla, Dúlra agus Pobal. These are 4 sessions that lead to an advocacy and education paper and launched at our Apple Festival on September 20th. There is 4 different sessions. I'll just share the screen. Hopefully you can all hear me. You're all very welcome. We have people in the room and we have people online. And the first session is from Mead to Pie to Pieces, Apples Then and Now, which Ollie Moore is hosting, and I'll be introducing him in a second. The session today will be followed in, I'll just put the poster up. So Apples, Nature and Community is our theme, and we have 4 sessions. On April 11th, I'll be hosting with Ollie a session on apple heritage and the local economy. And Friday, the 9th of May, we'll have community orchards for abundance, biodiversity and well-being, and finishing from orchards to action, art, ecology and climate resilience. This is a series funded by the Irish Environmental Network, and the partners, along with Club Jordan Ecovillage, include Cultivate, Irish State Savers, and our creative partner, Instant Dissonance. The song you heard as we were coming in was from Maggie McEntee, who's an artist based here in Cloughjordan, and that is available. So I'm going to pass to Ollie now, who will be holding this hour-long session. So we're finished at 2, and he can introduce our themes and our guests today. Again, thanks for being here. Maybe we could introduce ourselves on the chat if you want to create a sense of community. It's quite nice in the chat. And if there's any insights or links for our advocacy paper, if you put them in the chat, we can collect those. So thanks, and over to Ollie.
Cheers, Davie. Yeah, and actually these are Honeyball. You heard Honeyball being mentioned in Maggie's fantastic song about the walk. So just to give you a little bit on that, these Honeyball apple pieces are from last September, and they're still edible, and it's a great way to preserve apples. And that's the pieces bit in the Mead to Pie to Pieces. I also have some of my mother's apple pie, or apple tart, as she would call it, as well here, and some mead as well. So we have every one of the 3 things in our little session here today. So yeah, and just to introduce, so it's basically the history of the apple from the very, very, very beginning of what we can figure out up to today. And to take us through that, we have Máirtín, who's from Technical University Dublin. He's senior lecturer in the School of Culinary Arts and Food Technology. He's also author of this enormous, amazing book here in the front that people in the room can see, Irish Food History, a Companion. So it's an enormous tome of all things Irish food history. So Máirtín is also a chef and lectures in the School of Culinary Arts, as I mentioned. Regina Sexton then. Regina is in UCC, as I am occasionally too. Regina is a food and culinary historian and a food writer and broadcaster. And she's also author of A Little History of Irish Food. Peadar Kirby is here beside me. Peadar has been a journalist for the Irish Times and a lecturer in international politics in the University of Limerick. He writes on climate change and on Carol Polanyi, and is an Ecovillage resident, as myself and Davie are as well. And Rod Calder-Potts then, the last person that I'm bringing your attention to today, is an apple grower and farmer from in Kilkenny. His parents were as well, and he's from HighBank Orchards. HighBank produces an amazing array of apple-based products, lots of syrups, drinks, cider, driver's cider, stronger alcoholic drinks as well, and has an amazing orchard and setup in Kilkenny, which is well worth a visit. So these are our speakers today. They're going to take us all through this history from thousands of years ago up until right now. So I'm going to check in now to maybe ask Máirtín to get us kicked off with where it all begins. What do we know of the apple in Ireland? What's the earliest traces we have? How did people start engaging with apples back as long ago as we can figure things out from? Máirtín.
Thanks, Ollie. Well, first of all, I just need to correct you slightly, isn't that I was the co-editor of that great big book. I can't take the what you call credit for authoring it at all. 28 wonderful chapters by experts in different fields, but I'm the co-editor along with Dorothy Cashman of it. But actually going sort of chronologically through the book and seeing, because the book goes back 35,000 years. Starting with J.P. Mallory's chapter, he notes that apples are among the fruits available in summertime in the Mesolithic. So you had, amongst the fruit, you had, crab apples, raspberries, and vetch. They feature regularly in our mythological tales, but it's interesting. It's not really. It's not about sort of eating them as such. The majority of the reference to them in mythology sort of they relate to the aspect of their shape or play a part in describing what happens to Cuchulain's hair during his riostra, his distortions. It says that each hair would impale an apple, and I know that there was a great, I think it was the History of Ireland in 100 words or something done by the Royal Irish Academy, and there was a great image of the cover of Cuchulain's hair with an apple on each of his hairs as such, But equally, we find Findabair seductively doling out apples over her breasts to help lure Ferdia into fighting Cuchulainn as well, so that apples feature like that. And then moving on to the Neolithic, again, apples, there's evidence of apples, featuring in the Neolithic larder, along with einkorn, wheat, and blackberry and hazelnuts. And again, these are crab apples and cleaver plants and sloes and all sorts of other things, And again, Nicola Gilligan then in her chapter, looking at medieval sites, she notes that apples are rarely found on medieval sites which produce charred material, and that the low frequency of pips and apple flesh is unusual given the importance and ubiquity of apples in the early medieval Ireland. So we know about a lot of this stuff through literature, and one of the most amazing resources we have is a 12th century Gaillardic satire, Aisling MacConglinne, which supplies us with information about the symbolism of apples at this time, whereby the consumption of a poisoned apples by King Cathal of Munster results in the demonic gluttony, as in the demon of gluttony fits in his stomach and has to be lured out of him by starving him and stretching him to a wall, and and then what you call it, tempting him with all sorts of lovely delights of foods, So it's interesting, the fruit was used in a similar symbolic manner in Norse mythology, where it was used as a love token and fertility symbol. And evidence for both crab apples have been noticed on prehistoric sites. So it's interesting too that within the Aisling MacConglinne, there's distinction made between a row of fragrant apple trees and a bushel of wild apples. So by this stage in the 12th century, we're figuring out that there's actually not just the crab apples, but we've a variety of different types of apples, and it's interesting. Like if you have a look at, there was some apple endocarp found in Fishamble Street in Dublin, while pips were found in most of the Hibernian Norse assemblages amongst the archaeologists, including Waterford and Wexford. So clearly there was more apples around at this stage, And then in the Brehon laws, there was, for the damage of an apple tree, one could expect a fine of at least 5 dairy cattle, with this increasing if the owner of the tree was of noble ranking, So this shows unambiguously that the apple was considered as being a culturally important, element, rather than just a coincidental dietary inclusion. And I suppose out of apples you eat them, but equally you can make sort of cider or different alcoholic drinks out of them. There's a famous drink called nadanum, ancient drink made out of crab apples, and the dictionary of the Irish language sort of refer to a nadanum, maybe even referring also to maybe the juice, a drink made out of the juice of nettles. And equally, the idea about that not of them could be the idea about a drink that binds people together. So it could have been a ceremonious drink to actually bind people together. But there is evidence, from Ulster chieftains in the 12th century making cider, and naturally, as different planters came in and different other people came in, they would have brought those skills with them, whether they came from Cornwall or England or from the French, the Huguenots or the Palatines from Germany as well, would have brought those skills with them later on and developed it as we went along,
Yeah, that's fantastic, Máirtín. That's quite a romp you've taken us through there. I'm really fascinated at the idea that one apple tree was worth the equivalent of 5 dairy cows. When you think of Irish political economy right now, Peadar, oh my God, what a contrast. One apple tree is 5 dairy cows. Wow. We can come back to that one presently when we get up to the contemporary. But yeah, the fertility thing was very interesting as well. And if anyone else wants to jump in as well, and Peadar maybe intersperse as well. But just one thing, Máirtín, is there a particular time when we're certain that non-crab apples were being consumed? You were given some rough idea of periods, maybe 800 or 900 years ago, maybe, or what is the historical evidence there?
Well, I think from the Aisling MacCunglin there, that's sort of the 11th or 12th century, and again, because it's an oral tale, it was written down at that time, so it could go back to even the 7th century. Do you know what I mean? So so we're talking about that stage. Definitely, we have the sweet apples in, by that stage. But originally, it would have been the crab apple. But by that stage, we would have had it in. But when you think about it, sure, we found, I think it was Mariel McClatchy and her team up in UCD only before Christmas then found evidence of figs in North County Dublin, which show that there was trading with Roman Britain, So it shouldn't be any surprise, that we would have had apples, a different variety of apples in Ireland at that stage,
Yeah.
Agus a bhhairtín caithfí na log animnacha, cada haspáin siad sin doing. A go háire an bhfuil going an dagan na log animnacha go bhfuil an focail úl antú. Go dagan siad san aimsir na Normanach níos mó, nó an déan siad siar go dtí an ré of Normanach.
Well, tá sé dachar, Peadar, tá sé dachar é sin, tá sé dachar fáil amach go dtíreach cécha fada siar a héins na hanmanacha, So tá ólas áirithe thuas loganam.ie an suíomh idirlín atá iontach, agus tá réimse brá loganamnacha a play le úlaí agus le úlachort agus a lehéids, tá, I suppose, tá anna agin ar fad chundé Loch Garman agus Eulart, agus tá Eulart lí hís an freisin, Ach, aber tá bailí na Howlart hí sé géirí just an aice le trálí, tá sin tá áitina, tá áitís limnach ar a bhanim Úlla, agus Iomaire le OOLLA is stáda mar sin ar OOLA or whatever, Úlla, So tá Derry Úll, they're in the núll in the oak forest of the apples, ta cool the núll, capach the núll, the tillage blood of the apples, you know what I mean, ta lishin the núll, ta is áit ta an. Ta áit one he's a Loch Garman freshen, agus toil eta the merle, THEOIL, ach tagan sé on owl as in the apple tree. Ach an sin an nace leis tain an toil is dacha oil, agus an sin tá Iomaire le oilgate, a thugann tá áit star bhanam oilgate, sin an áit a bhfuil an toil seo, ach actually an bhfuilge tá oilgate thuas loganam.ie na Moileán na Gabhar, so Moileán na Gabhar was the sort of the level place of the ball level place of the goats, you know what I mean, ach is an nace leis sin a haggans an owl, toil.
So for the non-Irish speakers, just to repeat, it is fascinating the richness of place names that do include the word apple in some way, even a town here close to us in Limerick that is just named Apples, Úlla. So we can imagine how people enjoyed that. So we've
They have just in the English versions of these, because what happens with the anglicizations of these Irish place names is that you have this transliteration where the sound is kept but the meaning is lost. So you have Dunaula, Coronaula, Clunelty, Ahiola, Úlla East, Capana nÚll, Corúil, Corel, Lishina nÚll, Ulrich. You know what I mean? All of these names in the English language which really mean nothing, you know what I mean? But they've just kept the transliteration of, Capach na nÚll or Corn na nÚll or Cluin na nÚll, the meadow of the apples, etc. So, yeah.
How much we lose, yeah.
Yeah, great. And Regina, I was going to talk to you about the last couple of 100 years, but if you want to give any interjection on what you've heard there as well.
Yeah, I think it might be interesting for us to think about, I suppose, apples and culture. And I always start when I speak to the students by talking about Ireland, thinking about where we are from an environmental perspective, first of all. So if you think about Ireland and you think about apple cultivation, you will get almost at a native status, you'll get the wild apple or the crab apple, sometimes you'll hear it called. So that's here in the prehistoric period, and we have prehistoric evidence for that. And I'd also be conscious when I say anything, just depending on the evidence we have to be able to make statements. So a lot of it is speculation, but there is archaeological evidence for wild apples in Ireland. And then you come to the historic period, which for Ireland would be from the 5th century onwards. And of course, that starts in myth anyway, this weekend with the coming of Patricius and Patrick. So when we go into the historic period, when we actually have documentation, documents, manuscripts originally in Latin, and then going into Old Irish, that's when we have history written down. And one of the sources or the types of literature that's particularly useful for us in that period, there's lots of them, and Ireland is really very rich in its manuscript tradition in that respect. But one of the ones that's really interesting are the sources looking at society. And this is an agricultural society. And it's been glossed at this point in time with the coming of new ideas, new culture in the form of Christianity. And it's in that time we start hearing about possibly cultivated apples. And you asked about, wild and cultivated. Certainly, by the time they're writing the laws, which we popularly know as the Brehon laws, they're called the Corpus Juris Hibernici. It's then we start seeing the differentiation in the 7th and 8th century versions of the manuscripts between sweet apples, which we can assume and speculate are cultivated apples, but also the wild stocks. And it's in those accounts that they talk about protecting the crops, because you must remember that it's a subsistence agrarian economy. Wild food and cultivated foods are of high importance, and particularly when it comes to something like the apple, because the apple isn't just something to eat. The apple is also something and it's good to eat, particularly if it's sweetish, but it's also something that you can store for the winter. And of course, that's crucial to agrarian economies. So the apple is multifunctional. You can also dry it, of course. I think you had some there with you at the moment. So we do hear about this differentiation and possibly a difference in taste palates as well. One for the sour wild apples, and the other is for the sweet cultivated apples. And then to diversify that cultural glossing, we can also maybe think about the fact that we're an island, we're on the edge of Europe in the North Atlantic, so we depend on people coming to the island, but we also depend on new technology, new ways of thinking, new ideas. And with the coming of Christianity, especially with their connection to the philosophy of more so a plant-based diet for religious and ideological reasons, we must think about the influence of the Christian church in terms of apple cultivation in Ireland. And it's quite likely that those cultivated stocks are coming with advances in technology, particularly in terms of grafting, that's coming into Ireland with these new groups. So we do hear about the differentiation of wild and sweet cultivated, we'll call them. At this point in time, we can't talk about varieties. It's too early. But interestingly, and the great Celtic scholar who's written mostly about this period, Fergus Kelly, he talks about this idea of the fine for either taking or damaging apple trees. He differentiates between social hierarchy. So if I'm kind of a small farmer and you damage my tree, it's a certain fine. But if I'm higher up the hierarchy and you damage my tree, it's into the cattle that you're talking about. So this is a very hierarchical society. And the legal provision around that is dependent on that as well. The trees just fall into that. But the trees are protected in terms of the cultivated stocks and the wild stocks. And of course, what that is saying to us is that this is a society who recognizes the economic importance of apples, be it wild or cultivated, because of their multifunctional uses. So even though these are little just traces of information, we can speculate and we can say a lot about them. And particularly in terms of that first level of culture for Ireland, environmentally speaking, utilitarian speaking, and a new Christian input, you know, we can say a lot in that regard. And there you get sort of the evidence of archaeology and history. Then when you come into the other periods of Irish history, for example, the next period, there's the Viking period, well, the Norse really, because they're mostly Norse. But when we come into the Norman period, this is really interesting because now we're getting a difference in language as well, because there is a different linguistic, because they're talking about, you know, they're a mix of all sorts of stuff, but there's a French little trace in here now too. So this is when the linguistic area is not just the Irish language, but it gets a bit more diversified. And now again, you get another influx of people and ideas. So if you look at the written sources from the Norman period, for instance, they're now talking about orchards. Systematic orchards and the keeping of orchards. They're talking about the storing of apples in terms of apple lofts. And what we might also think about in this regard is that you have new people coming in to settle the country, and they have, and if you want to kind of put cultural difference between groups and their food cultures, what we always think about the Normans is that they're coming with technology, new ideas, and of course they're going to have a very strong French base, ultimately connecting to the Mediterranean and going back with their trading connections to the East. So we have another big, strong flow of ideas coming in here. And in that regard, we can talk about a diversification of animals, of the cereals, technology attaching to agriculture, but also for the Normans, and this is interesting in a contemporary perspective as well, when you think about the east coast of Ireland. When you're coming with the Normans, they have a greater emphasis on food of the fields. And when I talk about food of the fields, I mean cereals, but also the kitchen gardens for both medicinal and culinary uses. So we can imagine new types of apples coming in that regard as well. So this is kind of movement and migration coming with new ideas and possibly new what we might call today, even though we can't say this into the past, new varieties of apples. Yeah. And the apples, don't forget as well that these are societies that are very clearly skilled and informed about the multifunctional aspect of apples, not just in terms of storage and so on, but also what the apples can do. So we have apples that you might be able to convert into alcohol, whatever the history of cider might be as regards the evidence, but also apples that you can eat because they're nice to eat, but also the cooking qualities of apples. So you have all of that sort of skill and approach and this whole, way of thinking about apples in a historical context. And then, of course, after that, we get the plantation process in the early modern period, when there is a more systematic planting of the country. And at that point, it's really interesting because we can see from the documentation that they're talking about old orchards and new orchards. And this again seems to be another cultural layering. So what we take from that is that through time, we have a diversification of apple culture, depending on who is thinking about the cultivation, where the stocks are coming from, skills in grafting and so on, and new varieties that are coming in because of this mix of cultures. So it's really interesting because if we think about apples today and we think of environmental concerns, we think about diversity and diversification of stocks and so on. But what's happening in the past as well is that element and that almost theme of diversity is coming in a multicultural layer because of contacts with new people and of course new ideas. So it's fascinating. And apples is just a case study of a wider food culture in that regard.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Regina. That was another fascinating romp through a period in time. And I suppose as well, it makes me think of the Southeast as well. Máirtín, one of your documents you sent on to me talked about Waterford being the place with the most apples in Ireland at a particular period in time, or the most orchards. And I suppose the Southeast is probably that place with that cropping and cereal crops. And Rod obviously is in the Southeast as well. So is it the case that that is where most of the apple production in that cultivated sense has always been in Ireland, or has there been variations?
I think, again, it's just a matter of being opportunistic and also thinking systematically about food cultivation, particularly before the 18th century, when things changed considerably. So what you have there on the East Coast is the environmental conditions of more sunshine. So that's going to be more conducive to plants of the fields. You know, I'm talking about cereals and wheat, for instance, but also a range of fruits and vegetables. And that's interesting to think about, because we do have that legacy of the East being associated with fruit production. But don't forget as well, though, Ollie, the other area that remains, and I'm talking about remnants here now rather than a continuation of culture. These are remnants because you have breaks through time for various different reasons. The other area that we shouldn't forget to think about is not just the East or the East Coast, but also the northern counties of Armagh's beautiful, fantastic tradition of, and the associated culinary tradition as well, of orchards and orchard cultivations. And there you get interesting things to think about as well. It's just not the cultural gloss of environment, but the cultural gloss of new people coming into the northern counties. And that plantation of Ulster was a bit different in the plantation to other parts of the country, because you get more people on the ground, you know, coming in, especially with the connection with Britain, and especially the connection with Scotland. So you must think there, if you're just trying to dig in and do a core into kind of culture from a historical perspective, is that coming from those multicultural, well, from our nearest neighbour on the island across the way? Is that a legacy in that regard as well? Yeah,
Máirtín, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, no, it's just like, as I say, if you look at the map of where all the place names are, they scatter all around the country, you know. And again, you know, sure, Armagh is known as the Orchard County, you know what I mean, and it's a very strong tradition there for a long time. You know, you've like Kilkenny, Waterford, Wexford, you know, as I say, all the Sunday Southeast, exactly as Regina was saying. And it's interesting, exactly what Regina's saying about that. You have a look at, you know, there are people who think that we don't have an Irish culture, but I think anyone who looks anyway deep into it finds out not only do we have Irish food culture, but we've regional food culture, because that, you know, what grows is influenced by the geology and the geography and the climate and all that sort of stuff. And it's interesting, for example, you will always find oats. Now, I know you have Flahavans oats and all that down around Waterford, but you'll always find, if you look, you know, you find that the oats are mostly grown up in the sort of poorer lands of the northwest of Ireland and along the western coastlands, you know what I mean? Whereas the, you know, the barley and the wheat and all is mostly down south and the southeast as such, and those rich plains and etc. You know, so this is important. But as Regina was saying there as well, as you do get the various different plantations coming in, like there's plenty of evidence, you know, from those sort of big estates as such. You know, you have Lord Barrymore's gardens and orchards in Castlelyons, you know, had apples and pears and cherries and damsons and plums and apricots and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, Richard Boyle, the Earl of Cork, imported apple trees from Bristol for planting in Youghal. And there's, you know, many of these varieties survive to this day. And that leads nicely to the sort of work that the seed savers have been working on, because in their project, they've identified over 180 different Irish varieties of apples, you know, some of which have been around for over 500 years. And that's why I loved I love the song that opened up the piece, because the names of some of those varieties are fantastic. You know what I mean? The Maiden's Blush and Buttermilk Russet and Bloody Butcher and Greasy Pippins and Lady's Fingers of Offaly and all of these. And one of the ones I love is comes from Mark Jenkinson, you know, up in Slane, you know, and he has his he makes the cider, but it's cockagee or cockagay, you know, because really it comes from cock ungay, as in the shit of the goose. That's, you know, and it was a variety of apple, you know, and there is a color, I'm not sure if it's on Farrow and Ball color chart for paint or whatever, but it's called goose shit green, you know, and what you call it. I think, you know, this particular variety was thought to have been sort of extinct or whatever, but I think Mark Jenkinson feels that he came across it in Gloucestershire, but that it had been renamed Hen's Turd. And then that would make sense because cock, you know, being shit Oscailge suddenly could have been like a male sort of hen, you know, as a cock, so could have become a hen, and then the equally knowing that it was goose shit then might have come into the turd. So it's interesting just how linguistics shape these things, and with transliteration and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Even this variety here, we have this Miss Perry type of apple tree here. This came from a Miss Perry in Donegal, apparently, that the seed savers really brought back from oblivion, really. But it produces an enormous, juicy, abundant apple. It's one of our, and it's self-rooting as well. So it's really, but it was just one farm in Donegal that kept that going, one household actually in Donegal that kept it going. And it was the kind of apple that could compete with the kind of enormous apples that came in 1978, Rod, when Ireland had joined the EEC, but were 5 years into the EEC, and the proper common market opened up. Can you tell us about that period, Rod, in time when you were, your family were involved in apples?
Yeah, we did. We came in at a funny time. We came to Ireland in 1961 from South Africa. And we were in a hurry, took over the family farm, and we started growing hops. So we were completely occupied in getting the hops going until 1969. And then we planted 50 acres of apples. What was new about the apples was that they'd done a lot of work in England about root stocks, mainly initially to get control over the woolly aphid. But also to control the vigor of the different varieties of apples and so on. And they reckon they had it all worked out. And they'd done a huge amount of very important work. So we planted this great variety of Golden Delicious, with every 10th tree was a pollinator. And then we also planted some Spartan. We took this on now. We planted sort of 10 acres a year for 5 years. So we had 50 acres very quickly. And we were producing 600 tons of apples a year. We realized that marketing was going to be a major issue. So we got into cahoots with a great McCann group. And Neil McCann was the king of fruit in Ireland at the time, and Neil took it on himself to market this. But it was a huge job, 600 tons. Now, as I say, we planted them in the first of them in 1969. By 72, even these little baby apples, apple trees, by 72, they paid off our entire investment. They owed us nothing because we had the market completely to ourselves. And French apples and British apples, which were a thing at that time, weren't allowed in here until we'd sold ours. So it was great. And it went on. Now we joined the EU or the EEC as it was then. I think in 1974, was it, Ollie? 73. But the apples weren't allowed. Their apples weren't allowed into Ireland. They were allowed in very late, and then earlier and earlier and earlier. And as they came in, they completely destroyed us. We couldn't sell. They had a very strong government-funded campaign called Le Crunch. Everything was about Golden Delicious in those days, because the big apple before that was the Granny Smith, and the Granny was coming in from Chile, New Zealand, South Africa, and the very southern part of Europe. You couldn't grow the Granny up here, but the Golden Delicious if picked early and marketed when it's still green, was a reasonable competitor, reasonable alternative to the granny. When the French apples came in, they were cosmetically superior to ours. They didn't taste as well, I don't think. I'm convinced that they didn't taste nearly as well as ours. But cosmetically, they're vastly superior. And the thing about apple marketing is, unfortunately, people buy apples with their eyes. The apple is, I think, even from the Adam and Eve story, they couldn't resist the big apple in the tree. Nobody can resist a lovely big apple in the supermarket. And that's what they go for. And they would just buy the French. You see, we here in Ireland, our weather is very changeable. You won't get a nice, even continental type weather where you get a pollination is nice and consistent. The weather's consistent, and you get all 5 seeds germinating nicely, giving you a nice uniform apple. So the apple's a strange shape. We could, with chemical control, keep away the scab, which is the other thing that sort of blemishes apples to a certain extent. But even these overuse of these chemicals tended to change the actual cosmetic finish of the skin.
So Rod, what happened then when you couldn't compete with these big French, voluptuous, perfectly cosmetically precise apples? What did your family do?
Well, there was just no sale. So you can imagine every year you've got 600 tons of apples coming on and nowhere to sell them. And even Avonmore had bought an English company called Just Juice. And I even tried to persuade them to, allow me to put in a juicing plant so that we could sell them as juice, because most juice isn't grown as juice. It's grown as an eating apple, and it comes from C grade, outgraded eating apple. So it's almost a free product, But Avonmore wouldn't cooperate with me at that time. So the government gave a subvention, and we had to denature these apples, and they would pay us for them, and then we could dispose of them as we wished. So basically, we put them into great big heaps, poured molasses over them so they couldn't be reused, and then gave them to farmers, to feed to their cattle. It was a dreadful part of my life. I was, had only just taken over the farm, and that was my first taste of failure.
Yeah.
So,
but also you were
eventually
you were saying to me as well, Rod, that like in some cases people just set them on fire, dug them up and set them on fire like the trees.
No, we set them on fire. Basically, even now, Golden Delicious is a superb apple. It really is, but it's very hard to market because you really have to market as a golden apple, not as a green apple. And there's no market for it really. But the workers on the farm now, they would for preference, they'd go for a golden Delicious or a golden James Grieve, and they were lovely. But you've got to get the government behind you or something to change people's perceptions. And so it wasn't like that. So when we decided to go back, we heaped with 32,000 apple trees. And when we finally decided to throw our hat in at dessert apples, we piled them into 5 absolutely enormous, great big heaps and set fire to them.
Yeah.
And when we went back into apples, then because you can't just switch from Golden Delicious to something else overnight. It's a big process. It's about a 10-year process to change your variety of apples. So when we did decide, we decided we'd go for processing apples.
Yeah.
Where people couldn't see what the skin looked like, but they could taste the gorgeous fruit.
That's very interesting from a cosmetics perspective, yeah. So I'm going to bring in Peter now, Peter Kirby, just to talk about what that kind of says to him about the political economy of the apple before we go back to yourself and Regina, more about the present cultural renaissance of apples, so to speak. But Peter, when you hear that kind of stuff, what does it make you think?
Well, I think it's a fantastic example, Rod, of it gives an image of the reality of what in English we call commodification, that the apple has become a commodity. And of course, this is what capitalism does to goods, and now we're talking about natural goods all over the world. The apple is one of the most traded fruits in the world, and yet we read that there's up to 7,000 varieties of the apple that have been identified, and yet what are mostly now marketed, there are probably six varieties that dominate certainly the major markets like the US. In Irish we call it trocht ara, which of course really sums up the reality of what's happening. It's treating it as a marketable good, trocht, for markets. And it's the changes that this brought about then in the way in which the apple was grown, moving orchards which would have typically had maybe 70 to 100 trees. Suddenly now you had 1,000 to 1,500 trees that were planted in a very sort of scientific but very close and dense way, and that destroyed then the biodiversity that would naturally emerge if you were, as we do here, if you plant many, many different varieties and give them the room to grow. And of course, the consequence of that now, and I'd be very interested to hear any of you referring to this, is that as the climatic conditions become ever more threatening with very, very sudden and strong changes in atmosphere. I mean, very sudden storms, for example, or heat waves followed by very cold spells. All of this is making the growing of apples, which now that they've become this marketable commodity, require an awful lot of pesticides, and it has made them very, very vulnerable to the pressures that come with climate change. And so we see actually the costs of growing apples increasing. In some parts of the world, there have been whole years where most of the apple production has been destroyed because of climatic conditions changing during the growing season. So costs are rising, and prices aren't rising at all as fast as costs. And this is putting long-term pressure on the apple as a commodity. Of course, here in the Ecovillage, we have 65 different varieties of Irish apples growing, and it is wonderful. That's why we have our Féile and nÚll in September, to see the absolute rich variety that we get and the staggered way in which they become ripe. So really from August until November, we have apples becoming ripe, different varieties of apples. So this is the reality of commodification, and now the highly vulnerable situation that we find ourselves in worldwide as a result of this.
Yeah, so maybe Rod, you could speak to that maybe just in terms of, I remember pictures actually of some of the orchards in South Tipperary where there was just like thousands of apples on the ground really suddenly from storms and then late frosts as well. I always get scared when I see a late frost if there's already been apple blossoms, because I'm worried about the fruit. Because when you live here, you start to get concerned about the plants that are growing here, and if you're saving loads of apples to store for the year as dried apples, you're hoping there's no late frost if you've seen those apple blossoms. But have you seen things over the years, Rod, recently that are different in terms of the pressure on producing apples in the current context, especially as you're organic as well? You're not using those fungicides in particular. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, Rod?
Well, we're completely organic. Now, by saying completely, all other organic orchards that I know of in the world spray. They spray with copper sulfate and sulfur mostly in order to protect their apples from apple scab. But in doing this, they do an absolutely huge amount of harm to the microbiome of the orchard. Now, we gave up spraying in 1986, as you know, And for a long time, having moved from a very, very heavy dependence on chemicals, we went from hero to zero. So no chemicals have passed through our gates since 1986. But the soil had to recover. All those microbes had to reestablish themselves, not only reestablish themselves individually, but the symbiosis with the other microbes in the soil and the air and so on which they depend as well. And this took a huge amount of time. And even now, 1986, what's the date? 2026, is that 40 years? It has, I reckon it's very, very strong, but it's not perfect. And we can do without chemicals completely now. But the trouble is, it's not good enough for the supermarkets, you know. So the dessert apple supplier is absolutely forced to use chemicals to keep that bloody awful cosmetic finish going. Now, as far as climate's concerned, we've noticed actually that those late frosts you talk about, Ollie, they're gone. We haven't experienced a late frost for a long time. We've got one variety of apple, Katie, that is a good sort of wind guide for that. It flowers very, very early, and we didn't plant a huge amount of it initially because it was taken sort of 2 years out of 3 by the late frost. Now it's never taken on us anymore. And also you talk about Ulster, Northern Ireland, Armagh, they used to just grow Bramley because it sort of flowered after their late frost. They're now growing pretty well everything up there. So I think climate change has had a benefit to Irish apples in that way. But at the same time, we get these horrible wet spells, which are completely unpredictable. And if they happen at the wrong time, you know, blossom time, they can literally wash away the blossom. And also they do kind of make it, we have these wet autumns, which make it difficult to harvest. Because gone are the days when we could pay people to harvest apples, you know, they cost so much to harvest. And we harvest completely by machine. Another little comment, by the way, just about something somebody said earlier on about the word cock with the apples. In Somerset, they call cider cripplecock. And there was a guy came and grew apples here in Ireland, and he was making cider here, which he called cripplecock. And he had a picture of a cock with a broken leg on the label, which was quite hilarious. I must see if I can get it off him and re-establish the name. But that was simply because of the effect that cider has on you if you drink too much of it.
Okay. Yeah. And of course, extreme wind then can just create this like deluge of apples that you have to process really quickly as well, which can obviously be very difficult to manage. But just while we've only got a couple of minutes left, I'd like to maybe check in with Máirtín and Regina on, like, Rod produces an amazing array now of like syrups and alcohols of various strengths and so on. Has there been some kind of a resurgence of interest in apple drinks and apple products and so on in Ireland in recent years? Maybe Máirtín, I'll bring you in first because it's been a while since we've heard from you. So what's your thinking on that?
No, there clearly has. Like, I suppose when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, like, it was Sidona was the big thing, you know, and then the Bulmer cider, and even actually the ciders it was like maybe Old English gamer cider stuff used to be coming into the off license and stuff, and the lads be on drinking the cider parties and stuff like that. And actually, even that idea, like cider parties, that cider was a bit like what you're saying there, the influence of the cripple cock or whatever, you know what I mean? That the ciders was nearly associated with sort of the legal drinking or underage drinking as opposed to discernment as such, you know? Whereas like ciders really upped its game now in the last 20 years, particularly, you could say, you know, and the amount of, I wouldn't have them, maybe Regina has the number, the amount of different cider makers out there, but like, you know, from Longfields and Slane and Dan Oh, jeez, the developments in County Mead as well. But there's a load of them, Stonewell, and there's loads of them. And what's amazing is actually Rod's doing a good job down there as well, because they're making, not only are they making the cider, but they're actually making the non-alcoholic cider, so that you won't, that the cock doesn't break its leg, you know what I mean, etc. You know, is it, what's it called, drivers, isn't it, or something like that? Drivers, you know.
Yeah.
So and all of that, and then the whole, like the development and the innovation from that, particularly what's happening, like like the Calder-Potts there are leading the drive here now with making sort of gins and making sort of apple brandy and all this sort of stuff, which is fantastic, and then all the syrups and the rest of it. So yeah.
So Regina, there's less drinking flagons in Stephen's Green as a punk in the 70s. That's not quite as popular as it used to be. But so what's your thinking on the current state of apple products in Ireland?
I think with the kind of the new found interest in cider, but also the emergence on the market of, kind of the value added products like the apple syrups, which are absolutely fantastic, beautiful products. I think when they've been sort of populating the horizon of people's consciousness, people are starting to think now, and I come back to this point in a minute, but people are probably kind of coming down a bit lower, and they're kind of thinking about apples as the raw product, the commodity, if you like, and they're starting to think about apples. And I think in people's minds, for some people, they're contrasting what we've kind of spoken about earlier. They're contrasting the limited availability of apples in the shops, because if you want, it's like a child's storybook, really. You get green apples or red apples, and that's about it. And I think the thinking, it's getting a bit more complex, and people are starting to think about varieties, different varieties, diversity. But they're also kind of starting to think about Ireland as a place that produces apples really well, apart from what we've spoken about. And the question, I think, that it's emerging now in the zeitgeist is, why are we importing apples when Ireland can produce apples itself? And I think that's where the debate is kind of floating at the moment. And that goes back to the bigger question, I suppose, that you can apply to all sorts of foods. It's this questioning of where our food comes from, what's the food supply chain, what is the food system? But I think the danger here, though, is that sometimes that thinking and those debates and those narratives can be within just one small group. So it can be sometimes it can be a bit exclusionary. So I think really where we should go from now, if we're thinking about the future, and the apple would be a fantastic example to pick, because it's almost a universal symbol of fruit, really, if you like. Because it's got that psychological, almost socio-psychological attachment with people. This would be a very good item in which to start the debate and thinking about food, where our food comes from. Why is the apple in the supermarket maybe different from the apple that you can grow on the tree? So I think that's where the debate is now. It's getting back to, maybe not consciously, but in a kind of a blurry way, it's getting back to, where is food being produced? Where does it come from? Why is it only these amounts in the supermarkets? Why is the apple on the tree different? And what's the bigger story behind all of that in terms of food systems, really? I think that's where the conversation is going at the moment.
Exactly. Great. Thanks very much, Regina, there. So like there's so much there. I mean, it's probably worth remembering as well that apple scab, there's nothing wrong with the apple. Like, it's completely a cosmetic concern. And I suppose there's a great democracy as well when you do get the apple trees in and planted, which is a huge part of what the seed savers are doing now as well, in terms of traditional orchards and getting them out into communities. You go from a culture of scarcity to a culture of abundance. Like, we have so many apples to manage here that we end up organizing an apple festival where we mostly press apples and go home with like liters and liters and liters of apple juice to get us through the autumn, because it's amazing the difference, like, between it's a democracy, it's a commons, it's so many potential things which are abundance, which is the exact opposite of capitalism, which creates an artificial sense of scarcity to drive price up and to make things then elitist if you try and change anything in any way, shape or form. So it's very interesting.
Ollie, I brought my students down a number of years ago to to HighBank Orchards. And one of the things that stood out with me particularly and really resonated was that Rod has the apples sent out for juicing, but he makes sure that the pulp is brought back. And am I right, Rod? Do you know what I mean? So that
we pulp our own, and
or
at
pulp,
the moment we crush all our own juice, but we give the pulp to my neighbour to feed to his cows, and then we would deal with him if we want the stuff back, the shit back, and manure back for.
No, that's the key thing. The key thing is that there's actually a cycle here happening. So actually, you're getting the benefit of that back. Do you know what I mean? Which is really important, so that you're adding that nutrients back into the soil as such.
Yeah. I know, but the thing is, the commercial reality is that we really should be finding a use for that, for even to sell the pulp. You know, it's full of goodness. It's absolutely full of pectin and so on. So we're looking at the possibility of drying it and cubing it and selling it as dog food and so on. But it's a lot for a small farm to get around. You know,
but like with all the moves towards the circular economy, we do have to start thinking about that. Like certainly the local free-range pigs in a 20-mile radius of this eco-village get a great bang out of the apple festival we have with the pulp they get to eat afterwards. So I'm going to hand back to Davie now in a sec, just because we're coming to the end of the hour. Thanks everyone for sticking with us on this romp through history. Next time we'll talk maybe about fertility as well and the apple and what role it played there. I didn't get to talk about that with anyone this time. And I know for hand fastings, for example, people often plant apples. But for now, I'm going to hand back to Davie. I'm going to thank Máirtín, Regina, Rod and Pader for their contributions. So thank you very much. And I'll just hand over to Davie to tell you about the next couple of Apple webinars that are coming up and the wider project.
Thanks, Ollie, and thanks everyone for joining us. As Ollie said, this is the start of a series of apples, Aptly events. But the next one then is next month. We're not seeing that.
Friday the 11th of
April. And we're looking then at apple heritage and more on the local economy. One in May, the last one in May, I should have been more prepared, sorry about this. In Community Orchards for Abundance, Biodiversity and Wellbeing, that'll be held by our partner, the Seed Savers, the Irish Seed Savers. And then the last one is more creative, From Orchard to Action, Art, Ecology and Climate Resilience, held by Instant Dissonance, our partners. We end this whole season on September 20th with Féile and nÚll, our Apple Festival. And so just to close, thank you for spending the hour with us. It's been really insightful, and hopefully this will build into our next webinar and have an output of an education or advocacy document around the programme. So hopefully we see you at the next one. Again, thanks to our partners, Irish Seed Savers, Cultivate, our creative partners, Instant Dissonance. The Ecovillage is the lead and supported by the Irish Environmental Network. Thanks everyone that came in person and everyone that came in line. I will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cat's head, pig snout, golden spire, Sam Young, Bally, Fat and Greasy, Pippin, Dockney, Honey Ball, Summer John, Gibbons, Russet, April Queen, 8 Square, Lady Suddenly, under the golden canopy. Late September, go down to the village, take the apple walk. The sun is low these evenings in the fall. The trees are all aglow, they're putting on a show. Summer, when honeybee and crickets sing, and on the blossom flower, on to autumn bring the apple town wonder. Hear the blackbird sing of the golden spire and the April Queen. full of lee, so heavy, ripe and ready beneath the canopy. Ooh, take the apple walk, gather from the ground. The breeze has blown down, you'll find them all around. Some are bruised, some are smooth, some won't let go at all. They are waiting for the right time, time to fall. Ooh, take the apple, take the apple, take the apple walk. Together we can talk and learn about each other and how the apple falls. Take the apple walk. Together we can fall and learn from each other. That's how the apple falls. Take the